Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. I've got a very special guest joining me today, somebody that you're all very familiar with, somebody who has been really front and center on this mass discussion of late, and that's one of the main reasons why I wanted to have him on today, but somebody that you've seen me talking about for a long time now, somebody who has really shown the kind of integrity and courage it takes to step outside of the mainstream controlled narrative and actually do what's right, and that is Ben Swann. Thank you so much for joining me today, Ben.
Pleasure to be here, Ryan. Thank you.
Yes, I'm sure all of my audience out there is very familiar with your work as of late in this topic, as well as everything else in the past. But we want to focus today specifically on this very, very contentious point that is it centers around the science, seemingly, even though most of these people are not actually looking at the science, which is a really interesting development. So before we get into this and discussion of the mask and the science around it, I was curious, before this was politicized, before we got to this point, even just pre-COVID-19, what was your perception of masks before that? I think it's probably changes for a lot of us since this has been developing.
Well, I think the idea, well, let me put it this way. The only time I had seen people walk around in masks is when you see people who come from Asian countries, right? So people from Thailand or people from China will come to the United States, and they all walk around with masks on. When they get on planes, they're wearing them. When they get on buses, they're wearing them. And, you know, so I've seen that in the past. But typically, I think most people kind of reserve the idea of wearing a mask for someone who's working in a doctor's office. You're wearing a mask if you're in a dentist's office or in a surgical setting. If you go to the optometrist to get your eyes checked, they're not wearing masks there. You'll walk in and sit down, and they'll be close to your face. But unlike when you're in a dentist's office, they're going to wear a mask, obviously, because your mouth is open and they're above you. It's really to stop the projection of fluid. So I think most people prior to COVID, and myself included in that, didn't really think of masks other than in that kind of a setting. But then all of a sudden, when there's talk that everyone needs to be wearing masks, I think as a journalist, the question becomes, this is based upon what? I don't have a problem with people choosing to wear masks if they want to wear masks. There's nothing wrong with it. If you feel that a mask will keep you safer, and if a mask can keep you safer, either from infecting others or becoming infected, there's nothing wrong with wearing a mask. The issue is, as a journalist, when you are told that some government, issue has been made either by a governor, a mayor, or a president, or by Congress, or whoever, or by someone like Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's not even elected at all, he's just a career bureaucrat. And so when these edicts start to come down, everyone must wear a mask. As a journalist, you have to ask the question, why? Why is everyone wearing a mask? Why are we talking about fining people in Indiana $1,000 plus 6 months in jail if you don't wear one? And so the question becomes why, and for me, that's kind of where it started from.
Yeah, most definitely, and I think that's the real linchpin. The focal point of all of this is the constitutional rights, which is interestingly becoming kind of this that's just an old document, like this kind of, even though they all swear oaths to get the power that they currently have, they pretend like this some kind of archaic idea. But it definitely is what it comes back to. And to answer my own question, I found, if you had asked me before this, I probably would have been like, well, they probably help stop viruses or stop sickness from spreading, or just kind of, as they put it, it's just general consensus, general idea. But as you put it, when this started being forced down, okay, well, then we have to find out, well, let's dig into this. Let's do our own research. And I did the same thing and went in and started finding, well, wait a minute, the science doesn't seem to line up with what I'm being told. So it's interesting to see this kind of evolution, that just because something is generally accepted doesn't make it the truth. And this is an interesting kind of evolution of this whole process. Now, what for you was you kind of just said it was the rights, or the fact that they were forcing these on you, and what was it that kind of drove you to take up this mantle, to die on this hill, as it were, as this very contentious point?
Yeah, well, I didn't even think it was that contentious of a point. I know a lot of people are upset about it. Personally, my personal belief is, I've seen people wearing them. I see people driving in their cars with them on. It looks ridiculous to me, because I'm a thinking person, right? And I think for anyone who thinks critically on a regular basis, you ask the question, like, why are you doing what you're doing? And so when you see someone driving in a car wearing a mask with their windows rolled up and they're the only one in there, you say, why are you doing that? Like, how is that protecting you from anything? And so, for me, it doesn't make logical sense when you look at it in the beginning, right? Logically, I'm looking at this and saying, well, that doesn't make sense. Then you go into a grocery store and you're being told, well, you must wear a mask, you must stand 6 feet away from everyone else. And you say, okay, so I'm standing at a distance and I'm wearing a mask, but no one's wearing gloves. Everyone's hands are uncovered. And then I see people constantly adjusting their mask, which means now as a journalist, I also know I've been reporting on this since the very beginning. And I know that early on, the very first advice we were given by Fauci and Birx was don't touch your face. And remember, even Trump had that funny moment where he said, I haven't touched my face in weeks. I'm starting to miss it, right? But that was one of the first recommendations that was made. And then another recommendation that was made was don't go out and buy a mask because first responders need them and there'll be a shortage. You don't need a mask. That's what we were told in the beginning. So in the beginning, you're told don't touch your face and you don't need a mask. And then all of a sudden there's this about face where we're told you must wear a mask, even if it means touching your face. And so again, if you're a critical thinker, you just want to know, why is that? What changed in a matter of weeks that went from you should not be wearing a mask, save it for the nurses and doctors, to if you're not wearing a mask, you should be locked up? What? How did we get there? And so for me, that's really where I wanted to start digging in and find out, is there any kind of study that's been done on this? And what I found out is there have actually been a lot of studies done on this.
Yeah, and that definitely was the first part for anyone that dove into this topic. If they actually began doing the research to discover that it's not really lining up with what we were being told. And interestingly, the World Health Organization, all the way up until June, even said that there was not enough scientific evidence there. And, you know, this sudden shift, we're being told that the science is rapidly evolving, which is this term that suddenly applies only in the moments when they want it to, right? It's this really interesting thing. So which brings us to the science. And this is what's so interesting about it, is that for me, the first time I started diving through these things, I kept seeing a continual, very common thread. Not enough evidence to support any effect on transmission, more studies needed. I went all the way back to 1981, probably even further than that. And as you did on your show, all the way up until May 2020, even further, finding the same thing from the CDC. So what was your evolution in this research, and between then and now? So what was the first thing that you saw, obviously, as you dove into it?
Well, what I essentially saw was had been a number of studies done really between 2010 and 2020. So over the course of 10 years, about a dozen studies that have been done that go into depth on this. Now, these studies look at various things. And so one of the criticisms, and I think it's a fair criticism that's been made, is some of the studies that I looked at talk about mask-to-mask comparisons, an N95 mask compared to a disposable mask that a nurse might wear, right? And so there have been these comparisons made in some of those, but some of those documents did not compare that. Those studies were comparing mask to no mask. I think I'm going to admit a mistake here. I think one of the mistakes I made is I looked at too many studies. I brought too many studies forward when covering this. And I was just trying to give people the breadth of the full amount of study that's been done on this issue, essentially saying there's been a lot of studies on this. What none of those studies found, though, regardless of how you look at them, found a significant increase in protection. None of them found that, from type of mask to no mask. And then when after the story obviously went viral, I had a lot of people who, these fact checkers, who started attacking it. And so then I came back and I said, I'm gonna follow this up by fact checking the fact checkers. They say that, as you said, this is evolving science. It's going so fast that everything I had said was considered, their words, old data, old science. I mean, old science is like something from 40 or 50 years ago, not 6 years ago, not 2 years ago. But let's set all that aside. And so we look at a study from the CDC published on behalf of the WHO to make recommendations to the WHO in May of this year in regards to this coronavirus pandemic. So it's clear as day, crystal clear, that focuses on whether or not masks work. And what the study found was 3 very important things. Number one, that if you wear a mask, that there is no evidence that wearing a mask versus no mask reduces the chance of getting a virus. Yes, it reduces the chance of projectile coming out of your mouth. Yes, it reduces the amount of spittle that you're going to get on other people when you're talking to them. That's true, but that's not what the study is looking at. The study is looking at transmission of virus. Virus is not transmitted merely by you're talking to someone too close and you got spittle on them. doesn't work that way. And so the idea that because you're covering your mouth, you're now protected, that's psychological, but that's not science. Science is saying, these studies are saying that they do little to nothing to decrease the amount of contagion from one person to another in terms of the person who is sick, who is transmitting it to someone else, or the wearer who's trying to wear it for protection and not contracting the virus. It found that there was no evidence, that's the word that they use, of that happening. And then the other important issue, and I think this is so important, is the study also shows that if you're wearing a cloth mask, you're actually putting yourself at greater risk for infection. Because number one, the cloth mask has no N95 respirator on it. It is a poor design. It's loose fitting around the face, which means those virus particles are able to get in. You're not stopping that from happening by wearing this mask. You might be stopping, large projectiles, but you're not stopping virus. And that the fact that we're constantly adjusting and touching it means that we're actually at risk of becoming infected at a greater rate than not wearing a mask at all. That's what the science says. And yet you have these deniers who are coming out and saying, no, that's not true, not true. This guy doesn't know what he's talking about because masks absolutely, absolutely work. But they're basing that on what they hope to be true, not what actually is true.
Or the idea of common sense, right? These things are very common, but when you dig into it, it's not very sensical at all. And in your defense, the mask, I made this point on my show, which is this is the kind of fallacy argument we're getting. The argument about mask versus N95 was the way that they tried to say, well, he's wrong because he wasn't comparing the right thing. I've done the same. I went over 50 plus different studies that show you that there's no scientific evidence of difference between N95 and medical mask. So it's basic logic to then say, okay, if we have another study that shows N95 versus mask, it's the same logical step to realize if they're the same. It's just frustrating. They dive into all these different things and trying to take their attention into the wrong direction. And the spit, I think, is a very, very important one. Because this is the thing that I've come, and you tell me if you see the same thing, is that we're talking about droplets. And that's what you were pointing out. It's always about the spread of droplets. As the studies you pointed out and some that I did as well, it makes it clear that even the medical masks, sometimes upwards of 50%, even the spit gets through. That's NIH studies. But the difference, as I'm sure you know, is the aerosolized virus versus the droplet. So nothing they're talking about, as you made clear, is in regard to aerosolized virus. Even the N95, 0.3 or bigger, won't stop that. So it's a fallacy. They're arguing about spit when it doesn't really apply. And I think that...
And to remind people too, that it specifically states on the box of N95 masks, but from the manufacturer, this will not prevent a virus. Right? There's a warning label on the side that says it doesn't work for this. And that's being done because of the fallacy of thinking, by putting this on, I can prevent virus. And again, so what's frustrating about this is that, again, thinking people can look at it and say, well, that makes sense. The virus is many, 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 many times smaller than saliva particles, right? It's these tiny, micro organisms that are essentially moving in and out in the air. And by the way, it also, we do know that coronavirus transmits through the eyes. So wearing a mask over your face does nothing to protect you if it's covering your nose and mouth, but it's not covering your eyes.
And this is where we come full circle back to the argument. They go, well, if it does anything, you should do it. And that's fine if you want to argue that. But it always comes back to the same point. Unless we can prove that it actually has an effect, but even then, which I'm not going to get into that argument, but unless we can prove it has an effect, then you can't be forcing these things on people, which is a constitutional right issue. So they go in this circle of argument, and it always ends up being pushed back on trust the government. And it's interesting. The mask, the box issue is really fascinating to me, because you probably saw the same thing, and we'll talk about the fact book checkers, and we could talk about it next. Is that on the box it says point blank that it does not protect you against COVID-19. My theory is it's because these manufacturers know quite well that it won't protect you. It doesn't do anything they're saying it does, so they're trying to get ahead of it. And it says COVID-19. My argument is they're trying to be like, hey, we're not liable. They're making claims, we're not. But it's interesting that somebody posted that in quotes on Facebook. Just a picture of the box and the name and what it says, and that was labeled fake news.
Right.
That is fascinating to me. So why don't you touch on your dive in with the censorship brigade on Facebook and all that in regard to your videos and how it applies in the same way that you're basically showing science.
I think this is the most important part of this story, right? It isn't the question of, because I think intelligent people can still have a debate about masks and whether they should be worn or not worn. I think the one thing we can agree on, we should be able to agree on, if you're not just a complete ideologue, is that the science isn't settled either way, right? So if you say, well, I still firmly believe that people should wear a mask, at least acknowledge that the science isn't settled on it, because you can show me a study from April and I can show you a study from May, and you had said before, trust the government. Well, which one are we trusting? Because the government said it in both, right? These are, go to a government website and both of them are saying at different times different things. WHO says at one point, don't wear it. Now they say, do wear it. So which one are we going to trust? So I think intelligent people should be able to acknowledge science isn't settled. However, you have this insane concept now that's been created by Facebook, which, interestingly, Facebook takes no responsibility for this because they have outsourced fact-checking to so-called independent fact-checkers, which essentially means that Facebook is not making itself liable to its own fact-checkers. If Facebook had, the Facebook verification police unit that went around as employees of Facebook and checked things, then they could be liable for saying things are untrue when they're not. But they don't put themselves in that position. They have these essentially George Soros funded, Democratic operatives. The group Lead Stories that keeps fact checking my mask videos is run by a couple of former DNC operatives and former CNN staffers who are getting paid by Facebook and getting paid by Soros groups to essentially go through Facebook and to declare by fiat anything they disagree with as being wrong. And that's hugely problematic. And the reason it's so problematic is because obviously, if we're talking about, Facebook, if we're talking about these platforms, as I said, so I had my initial story that was fact-checked as being wrong. So then I fact-checked their fact-check and then presented the second study. And then they came back and fact-checked that as being wrong also, right? And the crazy thing is, and I would be happy to read to you the first paragraph of what they wrote, because even in their fact check of my fact check of their fact check, they're wrong in the first paragraph like 5 different times. Statements they make, including saying this is a Russian-funded video. That's not true. That was published by RT. That's not true. We are independently created through my company. We run on Facebook independently, and then RT for free. They pay us nothing. Carries those podcasts as well on their YouTube channel. So we're not paid by them, and they don't fund it. They claim that the WHO study is not new, because what definition do you want to use as new? So government study that comes out 60 days ago is not new? What's considered new? 5 minutes? 6 minutes?
Whatever suits their agenda.
Whatever suits their agenda. And what's hilarious about that is they called it not new. But in the previous fact check, they had said that my data was old, and they were fact checking and correcting it with a story and a study from April. Mm-hmm. So they use a standard of saying April is the new information. I give them one in May and they say that's not new. Okay.
Yeah, and the worst part too is the systemic reviews. That's what most of these are. That's what I keep trying to show you, is that even Dr. Fauci had said that we can't do, research in the middle of a pandemic. Well, yeah, we all agree with that, right? So it's all been there and we see it, and they keep doing it. From, I think I went through at least 4 different ones over the last few decades where it said, meta-analysis, systemic review of all the science, and it comes to the same conclusion: not enough evidence that it has any effect. No more studies needed. And they didn't do anything again and again and again. And that's what's funny, is now they're grabbing up all the old stuff and saying, well, we're looking at it again, but we have a different view this time. Right. So it's not, most of these aren't even actually new studies. There are some new information, but it's just fascinating to me that one of the main ones they keep pointing to is the Lancet compilation that grabbed like 172. None of them were random controlled trials. 172. That's the cherry picking 172 things is pretty interesting. If you get none of them having the gold standard, but they keep pointing to that saying, see, 65% effective. And all they did is grab a bunch of old studies. And if you go through most of them, they don't really even apply to what we're talking about. So it's just fascinating. They're trying to corral this narrative into the way that they want it to be. You made a really interesting point about the cloth mask, which is the one that I think is, and this, we can get into the health discussion here. It's so interesting to me that there's nothing else that is challenging that today. or the 5 different NIH studies that I can find that show a verifiable, scientifically verified reduction in blood oxygen level from wearing a mask. I'm not seeing anything now that's coming out saying, well, here's our new opinion. They're only doing that in regard to efficacy. So where are we on the health discussion? Because as you pointed out, the cloth, as their own studies show, dramatically increases the risk of infection, right? So what are your thoughts on this? Why are we just ignoring the health issue? They're acting like that's the craziest conspiracy theory of them all.
Well, they are, and yet every single one of these studies also shows that looks at wearing those masks, right? Also looks at comparing it to other conditions that can be exacerbated by wearing a mask. Because whether we want to acknowledge it or not, when you wear a mask, you significantly lower the amount of oxygen coming into your system, and you increase the amount of CO2 in your system, right? And so what we see happening, for instance, there was just a headline the other day about a guy who was running a 2.6-mile jog, and his lung collapsed because he was wearing a mask while he was running. You have 2 students, there was a story about in China, who were in a PE class being forced to wear masks, who both got sick and collapsed because they were wearing masks while they were exercising. There are studies that show that wearing a mask when you have cancer is terrible for you, because cancer thrives in a low oxygen setting and does poorly when there's more oxygen in your system. So if you are a person who is susceptible to cancer or has had cancer, if you're walking around with a mask on, is this the best course of action for you? And this is what angers me, and it truly angers me about this discussion, is that we need to have intelligent discussions about this and not act like coronavirus is the only problem in the world today. It's not the only health issue in the world. There are people who have cancer. There are people who have all kinds of heart problems and joint problems and issues they need to see their doctors for. And we're being told that everything else needs to go on hold, everything else needs to be paused, and that every other health consideration must be ignored because of this one thing that we're pretending is the most deadly virus to have ever come across the face of the earth, when it's not. We still know, based upon the numbers that have come in, that none of those models that came from Neil Ferguson over in the UK, none of those models about we're going to see 200,000 deaths, none of that has happened as they predicted that it would. So if it hasn't happened as they predicted that it would, then why are we putting everything on hold and allowing every other health condition to be exacerbated because of this one thing called COVID-19?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And it's the question that's not being allowed to be asked today. And that's what's so frustrating about it all. The thing that I keep pointing out is the studies you referenced with ties to any number of the people we always, the media is generally pointing to alternative, as it were. Yeah. But the fact that they used incomplete information, estimates, to remove our lives from us, to shut down your business, to remove, to basically remove everything you think is normal. Now, when we're at a point where there's far more data to be looked at, and we're finding out, well, the death rate is actually far, far less, even ignoring the numbers that they're admittedly manipulating, or any number of these things. We're finding out now that at the very least, it's less severe. But you know what they're not doing is using that more complete data to give your life back to you. Right now, we need more information. So it's easy to see how quick and willing they are to remove it from us, but at what point will it come back, right? And that's what we need to continue to see, is that this is a narrative being built on disingenuous actions, on dishonesty, every step of the way. Whether we think that's all across the board or certain people doesn't change the fact that we should have the right to stand up and say no to any number of these things. Now, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to say in regard to the mask discussion. I know you're a busy man. If you had anything else you wanted to throw in there, but at the end of the day, I think what's important for us to see is that we need to be self-reliant, individual, whether we're talking independent media or just as an individual out there on the street. And I think the best thing to make that real is stuff like what you're building online right now, and stuff that will bring independent thinkers together at a place where they're allowed to speak freely. So to end today, maybe you can talk about your new platform a little bit, or if you had any other points you want to throw in there for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this mask issue is a great example of why we're creating this platform. So we're creating this platform called ISE.media, which is essentially a place for content creators like yourself to be able to come to build out your own channels and to be able to speak openly to audiences about what's going on in the world, and be able to question the narratives that are being forced on us. Now, I've had this vision for several years now. It goes all the way back of wanting to create this network back to 2013, but it was way too early at that time, right? We were way ahead of our time. So we hadn't really done it. And then in 2016, we started seeing, okay, maybe there's a need for it. 2018, it looks like we're going to need it. And in 2019, as we were starting to gear up, we started seeing that, oh my gosh, like there are content creators being purged every day. Well, then you come into this coronavirus moment and we see it accelerate far beyond what I would have thought what was going to happen. So this mask story is important, I think, for a couple of reasons. One is because, as I said, the science is not settled. And as a journalist, I'm not here to tell people that I absolutely have the answer. What I'm here to tell people is that while I may not have the answer, neither do the people telling you that they do. They're telling you they have the absolute answer about masks, and it's guaranteed that this is the right step for you. And what I'm saying is that in a democratic republic, the public needs to have, leaders need to have the consent of the governed, not the other way around. And so right now, there isn't a consent of the governed being gathered. We're being told you will do this, you will comply in all these different ways. And so what I think is really, really interesting right now is that as we're trying to get through this economic shutdown, medical shutdown, health shutdown that's going on across the country, we also need to recognize that there is an acceleration of removing any dissenting voice. And as I said before, these aren't legitimate people who are censoring on Facebook. These aren't legitimate groups who are coming in and saying, you're not allowed to speak because we are journalists and we can prove that this person's lying, right? They're not doing that. They're taking factual information and they're declaring it false. You mentioned about the N95 mask box. How can that be misleading or fake news? How can it be fake news? It says it on the box. All you're doing is sharing something that exists, and yet you're told it's a lie. Same thing happened. I had shared a picture of a flyer at an Ace Hardware in Michigan. You might have seen this, right? And it's this Ace Hardware, and essentially they're saying, hey, if you come in and you're not wearing a mask, the governor says we have to ask you to put on a mask unless you have a health condition. If you're not wearing one, we assume you have a health condition, and we're not going to ask you because of HIPAA laws, right? It's basically a business saying, here's how we're going to get around the governor's order that we don't agree with, right? And it gets flagged as fake news and misleading and censored. And when you look at the CY, what they say is, oh, HIPAA laws don't say that you can't ask. Really? Because that's not what this image was. The image wasn't making a definitive statement about HIPAA laws. It was making a defiant statement about following the governor's order, because the governor said, if you allow people to come into your place of business without a mask on, we'll revoke your business license. That's how the governor was trying to use a forced hand on people. And so what we see happening is anything that doesn't fit the narrative is being removed. So what we're doing is creating a platform for content creators to come. Obviously, we're going to have some standards on it. You can't place child pornography. You can't place videos of people being murdered there. Some very basic terms of service. But other than that, we're looking for content creators who want to challenge the narrative out there. And we're looking for people who have various ideas. We want to encourage a marketplace of ideas. We want to encourage people to think and to challenge each other. We believe that debate is good for this country, not bad. We believe that people having different point of views is a good and healthy thing, because out of that, I'm a true believer that out of that, that truth always emerges. That even though for today or tomorrow or for a couple of weeks or months, there's this mix up of kind of lies that get built into things. If you look at the overall arc of truth, if you're just honest and speak truth, it ages very well. I was just talking to someone about this recently about Ron Paul and his position that he took on the Iraq war back in 2003, when he was one of only 2 congressmen to actually vote against the Iraq war. Well, here we are almost 20 years later, and I would say probably 85 to 90%, not just of the US population, but the world population would agree with him and say, you were right, right? Not because the facts changed, but because truth remained truth. And it emerges over time. And so I think that when you build a platform based in truth, you can trust that ultimately truth is going to rise and it's going to prevail.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, and I agree. I mean, the classic sayings go to, paraphrase or even just butcher them. It's more truth, more light. You know what I mean? The idea that that's the solution. The solution to hate speech is more speech, right? And it's the same idea in all of these things. And to your point before, I think what's so interesting is that they're attacking what they're trying to pretend is your intent, as opposed to just saying, here's what I said and here's what the picture is. They're going, oh, I see what he's trying to do. They're trying to pretend that this means this and just, well, no, it says what it says. The box says that, or this is, and this is what they try to play this game with as well. That is a correct statement. The box does say that, but here's why it's misleading. And they're trying to play this game around it and just trying to at the end of the day, they're trying to tell you that you're not smart enough to do these research for yourself, which is actually what Forbes just talked about in a recent article I talked about today. It actually says, don't do your own research when it comes to science. They're actually telling people that we're not smart enough because we're not the experts, right? So instead of, it's just, you get the point. They're trying to bring
but then it raises the question, who's the expert?
Exactly.
Who is it?
Exactly.
Because they keep contradicting themselves.
It's anybody who's in their inner circle. And the moment that you challenge their narrative, you're no longer in the circle. So it's perfect. The consensus is always the consensus. It's the same way these narrative builders build everything that they have. And you made a great point on your video today in regard to Germany, is this is what we need to see in all of this. We keep being told that we're in a representative government. We're in a democracy, right? But if we actually believe that our desire is what's leading their action, where do we think we are right now? I mean, it's pretty clear that the majority of people don't agree with what's happening. Germany has a million people marching through the street, and they're not changing. So we need to wake up and realize that that's not what's actually happening here. And I think you see that clearly. I think we're all coming around to that right now. And to put an end on this right now, I think what you said is the real point here, is that nobody, and my viewers are probably well aware of this point, and nobody here between Ben and I are trying to tell you that we have the answer.
That's right.
Here's the science, they're wrong. Here's the answer, they're wrong. We're saying you should have the right to look at all of this information and come to your own conclusion about it. And they don't want that to be the case. And that has to give us all the answer we need today. So thank you so much for being here today, Ben, and walking us through what happened, because this is going to keep going on. Platforms like yours are going to become increasingly more relevant and important because, I mean, if you've had videos, I've had videos, everyone I can see that's talking about any kind of objective reality is having videos censored right now. So yeah. Doing what you
and they're not just being censored, by the way, but anyone who shares those videos is being censored as well. So it's not just an attack on content creators, and it's an attack on anyone who attempts to say, I'm having a different thought.
Well put. Exactly. Well, thanks for being here today, Ben. Any other things you want to add? Drop your social media links for anybody.
Yeah, you guys can find me on Facebook while they still allow me to be there. Just look for Ben Swann Reality Check on Facebook. And then, of course, on Instagram, it's at @BenSwann_ at the end.
All right, and I'll make sure to include all that in the show notes, as well as your new platform, Ben, and maybe we'll have to connect in the near future to talk about all the other things that are being misrepresented. So
absolutely.
Thanks again for being here. And as always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
Thank you. I see you.